Welcome to Anxious Like You, a podcast hosted by Micheline Malouf and Nadia Adesi, two therapists who are anxious like you. In each episode, Micheline and Nadia dive into their guests' experience with anxiety and give you the tools you need to face your anxiety head on. This podcast is made in collaboration with Dive Through, a mental wellness company.
Welcome back to another episode of Anxious Like You. Today, we are having a conversation about one of the most common questions that Nadia and I get on social media. We're going to be addressing the issue of good therapist versus bad therapist, good fit therapist versus a bad fit therapist. So we think this episode is going to be highly valuable. We're going to share some stories, some stories that you guys shared with us on social media about things that therapists have done that are complete no-nos. And finally, we're going to teach you how to break up with your therapist if you feel like they are a bad fit. So let's dive right in.
So excited for this episode. We've been talking about this one for so long because Micheline and I went on live one time and we were just talking about therapists in general. And we got a question of somebody mentioning, should my therapist be eating ribs during our session?
Oh my gosh.
And that's when we were like, okay, we got a full episode planned for this. This is a great idea. Yeah.
Oh yes. And then like the things that rolled in after that. So like that whole live was supposed to be about like anxiety questions or something like that. And then one person set off like, hey, my therapist does this. And then we just got an influx of comments after that. It was like, well, my therapist sleeps in session and my therapist like started snoring. And so we thought, whoa, we
need to do something. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And then ever since then, we've been getting questions like, have you guys released the good versus bad therapist podcast yet? So we figured it's time.
Here it is. So let's dive in, and let's start with, we figured it'd be really helpful to talk about the differences between what is a good therapist and what is a bad therapist. So let's start with the good therapist, start on a positive note and say, okay, so how would we describe, like, what would you, I guess, consider a good therapist?
I'm just going to throw out words, but somebody who's compassionate, empathetic, listening to your story, genuinely cares about you. One thing that
honest.
Yeah, absolutely honest to a point that isn't too harsh or too much, just like the right amount of honest to call you out when you need to be called out, but in a way that's respectful. What I always like say, because I always get the question of, oh, you're a therapist, but it's impossible. How do you not judge your clients? You need to judge people somehow. And I always say, like, when you genuinely understand someone and you take the time to get them and where things come from and why things are happening, it's really hard to judge them. So I think a good therapist is somebody, and this is what we're trained in, learning to understand someone on a deep level. A good therapist is going to do that, and that's going to take away the judgment, or at least give them a better understanding of who you are and why you do the things that you do.
That is such an important point, because you're right. People ask that. Like, I think a lot of people will say, I'm afraid to tell my therapist something because I don't want them to judge me. And I think that point is really, really important, because we are coming from a place of empathy. And that's a huge key factor that makes a good therapist. An empathetic therapist doesn't mean that they've been through your exact experience, but they can put themselves in your shoes through your eyes, not through their own eyes. So like based on your, history, the way you grew up, everything, they can, put themselves in that space as much as they can, as much as possible. And therefore that will remove judgment. So if a therapist is being judgy, it's also indicative of low empathy. And that definitely is not a quality that you want in a therapist. So, right. So like empathy is an important one, non-judgment, compassionate.
Accepting your clients as like wholly who they are. I think that, and not trying to change them in a way that they're not ready to change or that they don't want to change, just based on like what you believe should be changed as a therapist.
Yeah. They have adequate training.
Yes. Adequate training, which is important in learning how to understand your client. Just to add to our like last point, do I necessarily agree with everything my clients do? No. But am I judging them for it? No, because I'm understanding why they're doing those things. And I like, to me, that is the most important thing, and something I would look for in a therapist too. Like those first
Mhm.
couple sessions, you're really getting to know your clients for a reason. And maybe you're asking weird questions that they don't understand. If you don't understand a question, ask why it's being asked. But it's for a reason, to get to understand you on a level that makes sense to us.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, because oftentimes, like maybe we will see, or a therapist will see, some behavior that isn't necessarily helpful to you. And they're not, doesn't mean they're judging you for it, but they may disagree with the behavior itself. For instance, if you're in a relationship and you've just broken up with someone who is a narcissist, and maybe we know that please don't get back with them, please don't get back with them. But then you get back with them, we're not going to judge you for getting back with them. I know that's a fear of many people. It's like, oh my God, I
Yeah.
was afraid to tell you because I was afraid you're going to be mad at me or you're going to be judgmental of me. And all I can say is a good therapist will not be judgmental. They may be, hoping that you don't get hurt again. They may be telling you, calling you out and saying, I wonder what is making you get back into this relationship. Or maybe they'll even take it a step further and say something like, ask you, what would it take? Like, what's the final straw before, you can walk away? And that's just to evoke thought from you and kind of like introspection and figure out what it is that you're looking for. But they'll never be like, are you kidding me? Like, I can't help you. I can't help you. That's ridiculous. Like, you're not listening to anything I'm telling you.
And I think that will definitely go into our definition of what a bad therapist is, because I've heard endless stories from clients and just from talking to people of, they've told me that if I keep losing track with therapy and talking in a way of like babbling on, then they can help me. And that was actually something a client told me recently, that they were in a therapy session and they were kind of going off track a little bit. And their therapist said to them, if you keep going off track, I'm not going to be able to help you.
Oh no.
And yeah, like to me, that is not the solution.
A therapist is trained to pause you, ask you to slow down, and
Mhm.
ask you to repeat things if needed, or ask you, or say, hey, we're going to talk about all of the stuff you just mentioned, but can we take it one step at a time, in a very compassionate and nice way. If your therapist is saying what Nadia just mentioned, like, I can't help you because you keep going off tangent, like, that's basically your therapist's stress response coming out because they have no idea what to do and they clearly don't know where to start, and that's just a bad sign.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think you raise a good point in your therapist stress response coming out. A good therapist will have self care, will know how to handle themselves when things get stressful. Like, we're in this profession, we need to
Mhm.
know how to react and respond when things are hard. So
Yes.
I think a good therapist is trying, at least trying their hardest to model behaviors that they are reinforcing to their clients.
Absolutely. Yeah, because it's sometimes normal to feel stressed with a client, because obviously co-regulation, and we also feel an empathy. And so if somebody's stressed, it's natural for a therapist to also feel that stress. But if that therapist is then transferring that right back to you, or saying something that's invalidating or shameful, which will take us into the bad therapist section we'll talk about in a second and share some of the stories we've heard. But in general, like, yes, having a therapist that admits, hey, my nervous system's a little off whack right now, that's okay. But if they're blaming you for that, or telling you you're too much for them,
Yes.
then that's not.
No, that's awful.
It's so
Yeah.
awful. And we do want to differentiate. We're going to talk about something called the good enough therapist. And this is an important point we'll talk about later. So I'm going to come back to that point, because there's no such thing as perfection in anybody. So we want to always look for the good enough
Yes.
therapist. And that is something that I learned from a book that I read by Pete Walker, who's a therapist, and he has a book called The Tao of Fully Feeling, and then Complex PTSD from Surviving the Thriving. And he highly, highly, highly emphasizes the good enough partner, the good enough friend, the good enough parent, the good enough therapist, because we never want to go into looking for perfection, because then we'll always be disappointed. But we'll come back to that point in a minute when we're talking about good fit versus bad fit. But let's go into bad therapist stuff.
Bad
So
therapist.
yeah, what makes a bad therapist?
Oh my gosh. Just some side note here. We are not trying to come off like we are perfect in any way. We know we're not.
No.
But there's some things that you, our audience, have been sending us that we read in pure disbelief that these things happen. Like the
Yeah.
rib situation. I mean, I can have some empathy towards being hungry between sessions and maybe grabbing like a quick snack, but ribs and like sauce and the chewing, I
No,
can't.
no eating. Like your therapist should not. Okay, let's start with this. Your therapist is reserving, there's 1 hour you're paying for, whether it's insurance, even if the therapy is sliding scale, even if you're paying out of pocket, even if it's free, it does not matter. That hour is the 1 hour that is reserved for you. So if a therapist is using that 1 hour to eat their meals, to text a friend,
Oh,
to take a
texting.
nap, then it's not your hour. They're using that, you're being cheated of your hour. Nothing personal should be happening in there on the therapist's part. It should be 100% you. It's a therapist's responsibility. So a lot of people ask, why is the therapist hour 50 minutes? Like, how come we don't get 60 minutes? And this is one of the reasons. Therapists need to pee between sessions. Therapists need to eat sometimes between sessions. Therapists need to get a drink of water or stretch their
Yep.
legs or their backs. And so we give that 10-minute buffer to be able to take care of ourselves between each and every client. So if your therapist isn't doing that, maybe that you see them like letting go of one client and then bringing in the next one. But then it's fine if they're not like, falling asleep on you or eating wings in session. But then if they're doing that and then getting up in the middle of session to go to the bathroom or eating wings, then they're not modeling good boundaries and they're not modeling good self-care either.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's so true. And there's obvious things that may not seem obvious to everybody that therapists do that don't make them the greatest therapists, like eating, Micheline said, sleeping, calling, social media, anything like that. But then there are things that therapists do that aren't so obvious that still are not ethical or not okay.
Exactly.
So part of this is, awareness of, maybe you ask yourself, okay, maybe it's okay if my therapist is doing this, or this is what a normal therapist does. So hopefully this will give you some realization of what is and what isn't acceptable.
Yeah, exactly.
With that being said, I think a therapist who tries to push a client beyond what they're ready for is
Mhm.
not a trait of a good therapist. Let's say, you're on the path of setting boundaries with your
Mhm.
family, but you're trying to do it slow. Maybe your therapist sees what's best for you on the other side and tries to push you to do it. But if you're not comfortable and they keep trying to force it more and more and more to the point that like it makes you feel pressured to do it, that's almost like bullying.
Yeah, because then they're not paying attention to your needs and they're not paying attention to where you are in your own healing journey. Again, that goes back to empathy in my eyes, because a therapist should understand that we all have different timelines and that healing isn't linear. And so if they're pushing and pushing and pushing, then that's an issue. So if we a good therapist in this situation, so like let's say you're talking about boundaries with family and you're not ready to set boundaries for whatever, there's hundreds of reasons
Right.
why you may not be ready for that yet. It's really hard. It's one of the hardest things we can do, especially with family. A therapist can help you explore why it's so hard. A therapist can
Yeah.
sit in that with you and ask a good therapist and say, you know what, I get that this is difficult. Let's process why this is difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of saying, well, you're just not trying hard enough. That's something I hear a lot
Oh
from
yeah.
some followers that in the comment section saying like, my therapist told me that I wasn't trying hard enough.
And
And
that
that
like
is,
breaks my heart.
yeah,
I'm just thinking about myself being in the seat of a client and my therapist telling me I'm not trying hard enough. especially if you're already somebody who's, struggling maybe with low confidence or depression or even anxiety, and your therapist is telling you you're not trying hard enough. That's scary and sad and dangerous.
And I go back to saying that is the therapist's problem.
Yeah.
Because if your therapist is on the edge of their seat waiting for you to get better yesterday, they're not being patient. And again, this is a field that you go into. It's not like you go in and you have to make 20 sales by the end of the day. And like, this is like, there's no timelines and deadlines. And I know that sometimes with insurance, and if you, depending on where you're going, they may give you limited sessions, and that's totally understandable. But I think it's also the therapist's responsibility to communicate with the client and say, listen, we have 24 sessions because this is all insurance is paying for. I'm going to realistically tell you where we can be by that point. We may be ahead of what I tell you. We may be way behind of what I tell you, but healing takes time. And they'll help you find options for if you need to come longer. But they will never say, well, I need to get these results by session 10, because if I don't, then you're not trying hard enough.
Ugh.
That's so fucked up.
That is so fucked up. Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that. And I actually like the idea of, okay, by these sessions, maybe this is where we can potentially be, but that's at no fault of the client. And if a client has anxiety and you're doing CBT, which is common, and you're, giving out homework, and then you're getting mad at your client when they're not finishing the homework, and that just stresses me out, because I have anxiety. So if I didn't do my homework and then I was going to a session and then I had to be shamed for not doing my homework, and then I was already struggling with things, it's just a whole cycle of things that would just cause me more stress, and then I would avoid therapy altogether.
And again, it's like, what is the reason that client can't do homework? Like, what is the reason you aren't doing your homework? Maybe, there's issues, emotional issues, like, when we talk about motivation and like what happens, the emotions for doing something or procrastinating something, maybe that's what we need to process. It's not necessarily like, it's not school. You shouldn't be graded on this stuff. Like,
what if you don't like doing worksheets? There's alternatives. Ask your therapist, talk about it. You don't have to do
anything. So personally, I hate worksheets, and I hate when my therapist used to tell me to track my mood and tell me to track like I didn't like those very structured things, because my brain just doesn't function that way. I'm a Gemini. I don't know if that means anything, but like I like to think that I'm like this air sign that loves to just, I'm motivated by the moment. And so I need things that are more artsy, more free, not so structured. And so if my therapist were to be like, well, you're not doing your homework, I would develop a lot of shame internally. Like I would start to feel like I'm not good enough, even for my therapist. And that is like, you're one person that I'm paying to accept me.
And I'm not there. Yeah. That's so true. Yeah.
So,
and I think that's probably a mistake I even made, like fresh out of school, or even in my internship of, your CBT therapist, these are your structured sessions. I used to do trainings of CBT therapy, and it was like, this is how session 1 should go. This is how session 2 should go. This is how session 3 should go. So for me, as someone who has anxiety, I'm feeling stressed when things aren't going according to how they should. So it's like really separating yourself from that harsh timeline of things. And even I think it's experience too. I wouldn't necessarily say that if you try to follow structure and you don't, you're a bad therapist, but I think with experience comes recognizing that therapy's not black and white.
Well, I think that's an important distinction, because like, just because you give worksheets and you're very structured, that has nothing to do with you being a good or bad therapist. That is a style, that is an approach. Yeah. I think it comes down to, if your client is coming to you and saying, this isn't working for me, and as a therapist, you're saying, well, this is the only way. And well, then you're not trying hard enough. And if you don't do it this way, then you're not going to get better. That is the distinction, because if you can say, if somebody comes to you and says, this doesn't work for me, and you're able to say, oh, wow, thank you for telling me. Let's see what else we can do then. I need to let go of my stress of having to be in this structure modality, because I understand that the structure works for so many people, but maybe this client doesn't
Yeah.
like it. Maybe this client, actually I had a client one time that um I had asked, because I ask sometimes, I try to ask most of the time, but I ask, how is therapy going for you? Like, we've been seeing each other for like 6 months, 7 months, whatever. Like, how's therapy going for you? And I could tell that this client was like really nervous to say something. And I'm like, listen, I promise you that no matter what you tell me, I am not going to be offended, because I am here for you. And so the
Right.
client said to me, okay, this is really hard for me to say. And I'm like, I feel that, I'm here. Like, tell me. And then they said, I feel like I need more venting time. I feel like we're doing, like we're like jumping, we're talking, we're doing a lot more structured things. And I just need, I just need to be heard. I just need to vent. And so I was like, wow, thank you for that feedback. Do you want still some structure and venting, or do you want the whole session to be venting? What do you want? What are you looking for? And he's like, well, I think we can do most of the session venting, and then maybe the last 10 minutes, we can talk about
Yeah.
some like approaches. And I, first of all, that shifted our sessions completely, because and then the progress was made, because when a therapist is like, oh, wow, thank you. Like, we want to know what you want, right? Like, we
Yeah.
want to know what you want. And so you being able to open up to a therapist, that therapist should feel honored. I felt honored that client trusted me to the point where they could tell me that they didn't like something I was doing.
I was just going to say, I think the fact that you created kind of that like safe space, even though it was really hard for the client to get to the point of saying it, they did, and they were able to say it. And then you accepted that criticism. If it was even criticism, it wasn't, but you accepted that in a way of like, okay, what can we change going forward? Initially, like put into
Mhm.
action, what can we do next? I think that
Yeah,
is so
yeah.
important. Yeah.
100%, because I don't think it's ever easy to hear, criticism.
Hmm.
But if we look at it as criticism of being a bad therapist, then we're always going to remain stuck as therapists. But if we look at it as this is an opportunity to see what people out there want, and
Yeah.
our no amount of training can tell you what a human needs besides that human sitting in front of you.
And you
So,
know what's best for you. A
exactly.
therapist knows you, understands you, but if it's like in the back of your mind and you're thinking
Mhm.
about it all the time, you know that that's going to be the best option for you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So again, like a bad therapist would take that criticism and turn it on you and say it's because of you, right?
Right.
And a good therapist would roll with the punches and be like, okay,
What's
thank
next?
you. What's next?
Yeah. I
What do
think
we
that
do?
goes into like another good point of if you are in a therapy session and your client isn't getting what they need, or maybe something new comes up, or maybe a new diagnosis comes up and you realize, okay, this isn't something I can work with. Even if you have such a strong rapport with the client and you have a good relationship with them, referring them out to somebody who can treat them better or treat
Exactly.
them in a way that works, which is hard. Like I've had to do that, and I've had clients that I got along with so well. The relationship was there. We had that rapport. We were making
Mhm.
progress, and then life changes, things happen. And when a new diagnosis came, it was psychosis, and that's when I had
Yeah.
to say, okay, you know what, I need to refer you out to someone else. That's not something I specialize in, and I know
Mhm.
you can get better treatment elsewhere.
Yeah, that is so important. So a bad therapist would continue to work with you even though they don't have the training they need for that particular. So actually, Nadia, before we started recording, had mentioned to me, I don't know, on my TikTok account, I think it was, that I posted this video where I said, would you want your ENT acting as your gynecologist? Um, and most of us would be like, no, like
Hell no.
my ENT can stick to my ear, nose, and throat, please. Like hey, I'm an ENT, but I'm just gonna examine your pelvis, to give you a pelvic exam today because like we're running short staffed or something. Like you'd probably freak out and be like, no, I will reschedule this appointment. And so why do we sometimes expect, therapists to be generalists? And I'm not saying there aren't generalists out there. I just don't think it's usually the best care. I think the best care is usually from people who say, this is what I work with, because those people are going to be very focused and getting trainings for that particular area, like anxiety disorders or trauma or depressive disorders. Sometimes you'll see like a combo of 2 or 3, and that's fine. But if they're like, yeah, I do addictions and I do anxiety and psychosis and schizophrenia and, everything, and I use all of these approaches, then you're kind of questions like, what does, this mean? So like when you said, Nadia, that like I had a client that I had great rapport with, but then they showed up with psychosis, there was a diagnosis of psychosis there, you have to refer out, you have to say, there's better care for you out there.
Right. And there's also the possibility with certain things of different therapists working with different things. So I know we had Allegra on our last episode who was talking about how she had an OCD therapist and then she had another therapist, because if you're struggling with OCD and you're doing ERP, you're not going to do talk therapy. So like sometimes people
Yeah.
need both. And I think that's
Yeah.
okay too. So if you're a therapist and your client has the insurance to cover that or can pay for that, then it's a little bit different, especially if you're still willing to work, even as a team with the other therapist too,
Yeah.
if the consent is there. But I do agree. And I think it's funny because as you were saying, like a list of all approaches that therapists take, I was thinking about my Psychology Today profile that I haven't changed in like
Yeah,
3
same.
years.
Yeah.
And it was like when I first graduated and I,
Yeah.
I'm trying to build your client base and you're thinking that you can
Yeah.
treat everything because
Mhm.
the experience is not there. So I think that comes with experience too, and experience of maybe working with different populations or learning about different populations and recognizing which one you're most passionate about and which one you actually feel confident working
Yeah.
with.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true, because I think especially with like those profiles, I think people check off things that they know about. So I think that's where the consultation is really important,
Yeah.
because we might work with relationship problems and depression and anxiety and complex trauma. But if you have a consult and you ask the therapist, what is your specialty? Like, what do you really want to work with? What do you really work with? They're going to give you a list of like 1 or 2, or maybe maximum 3 things. But if they're confused by that question, then, that's where the problem lies. So I would say, like, yes, the profiles, take those with a grain of salt. I would
Yeah.
say the consultation is probably the most important. Yeah, because I think mine is the same way. Like if you go
Mine's
on there and it's like,
hilarious.
yeah, there's just a lot of stuff. And I haven't touched that in a while either.
Exactly. Yeah. It's so funny.
It's so
So
funny.
back onto traits of maybe not the greatest therapist. What do you think about therapists like who will take the side of the client's parents or guardian or,
Yeah.
someone who they're coming to
Yeah.
therapy about?
I think that signifies a bad relationship with the therapist, because you're the therapist's client, or the confidentiality and all of that is owed to the person getting treatment. That is the client. I don't care if parents are paying for therapy. The parents are not the client. The client is the person, even if it's a minor. Minors deserve confidentiality. I know there's a misconception out there that just because you're a minor, you can tell the parents everything. And that's not true. Yes, you need to tell the parents certain things if there's like risk or something like that. But if you're talking to me about a relationship, or if you're talking to a therapist about a relationship that you have and you don't want your parents to know, then the therapist doesn't have to disclose that if it's not like a risky, like you're dating
Right.
a 40-year-old man and you were like 12. There are
Exactly.
certain
Yeah.
guidelines, there are certain like boundaries we have to abide by for your safety, but for the most part, yeah, the confidentiality and the trust belongs to the client, and that is really important. So taking sides, when you ask that question of like taking sides, like if a client, because I've heard this on social media all the time, where it's like, well, I told my therapist that, this is how I feel at home, and that I don't really like my parents because they're treating me really badly and they're spanking me and da 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 da, whatever. But then my therapist said, you need to love your parents and respect your parents because they're your parents. And I think that's not only dangerous, but that's also demonstrating to clients that you have no right to set boundaries with your family. And I think that's so harmful, because how many people are afraid to come forward to authority figures in general because they're afraid of not being believed in cases of sexual abuse, in cases of physical abuse, emotional abuse,
Yeah.
neglect. People don't come forward because of situations like this. And then you have a therapist, the one person who's supposed to be an emotional sounding board and an emotional support system, taking the side of somebody who's potentially harmful to you. Yeah, I completely think that's wrong.
I agree. Yeah. And like if you're seeing a therapist at a young age and you put a lot of trust in them and you feel like you can believe what they say, having that told back to you of, but they're your family, but you need to do this, you need to respect, you need to love, you need to treat them this way. It's really dangerous. And then it can even become like a mindset that you have in the future because your therapist told you that and that's what you think is right and that's what you distinguished was right.
Yeah.
And it's dangerous. I don't like that. You
No.
should be your client's biggest advocate.
Yeah. You should be talking about the feelings that are going on there,
Yep.
and telling them how to set those healthy boundaries. Teach the
Exactly.
client. Your therapist should be teaching you how to set those healthy boundaries with family that may be potentially harming you.
Right. And that's not to say that you're not going to call your client out every now and then of
Yeah.
when they see something of, certain behaviors that you're like, hey, why did that
Mhm.
happen? Or how come like we let that happen? Whatever it may be. I think a good
Yeah.
therapist also will call out in a way, like we said at the beginning, that's respectful and a level that doesn't seem too harsh.
Yeah.
But at the same time, your client is your client and that's who you're advocating for all the time.
Yeah, exactly. You're the one that needs to be advocating for them. That's the word. It's like advocating, supportive. Again, goes back
Yeah.
to like, what are the qualities of a good
Good
therapist?
therapist.
Keeping trust and confidentiality. And if you're taking the side of the parents, you've just broken trust. We're not saying like, oh yeah, like, no, go against the parents with your client. Like, that's probably not the healthiest either, but we're saying, talk to your client, like your therapist should be talking to you, saying, what makes you feel this way? What's going on? What happens? What have you tried doing this? Let's try to set this boundary if this helps you. Wow, that's really tough. I'm sorry you're experiencing that. Being really, really empathetic and there with the client, rather than saying, well, you're just being a little shit because I have a kid and
Toughen
I can
up.
tell you like, toughen up. I'm a parent and you have no idea how hard your
Oh,
parents work to make sure that you are taken care of, and you better respect them. And if you guys aren't seeing me, I'm like pointing my finger and acting like a grandma right now, because like, that is something I've heard. It's like the finger pointing and being like, you're just being ungrateful, which is gaslighting.
yeah. Oh, I hate that. That just gave me like goosebumps too of I'm a parent and I know how hard, it's very invalidating and not okay.
Yes. So invalidating is a huge
Huge one.
indicator. Shaming, invalidating, very
Yeah,
huge, big indicators of a bad therapist.
bad therapist and just not feeling comfortable. I think
Mhm.
a lot of the time your intuition will guide you in the right way too. And if you're not feeling comfortable, maybe after like a couple sessions, you decide to give them a chance and it's not working, then that's probably a good indicator. I remember seeing a TikTok video very recently and a therapist on the app, her ad is Strong Therapy. She actually responded to it and it was somebody who got a text from their therapist who sent them a video of a TikTok that was like on a really high building. And this client had suicidal ideations and suicidal thoughts. And the therapist sent the client the TikTok and said, luckily you don't live here.
Oh
Or
my
like
God.
and like joking around about suicide, and this guy is showing the text from his therapist like laughing about it, so maybe he didn't take it in a way of that seems a little bit unethical, but I think joking about suicide and texting your client TikToks and joking about it is crossing a boundary. And I
Mhm.
don't think that in any way is okay. Even if you have a joking relationship with your
Yeah.
therapist, even if you have
Yeah.
humor in your sessions and they bring things up, I think
Mhm.
suicide is one of the things that should be off limits. I
You
don't think
don't
that's
joke about
ever,
suicide.
ever. No.
No. No. And you definitely don't send TikToks about suicide sarcastically,
To your
saying
client who's
that's
suicidal or
wrong.
has been in the past. Yeah.
The only time a therapist should be sending you TikTok videos or YouTube videos or whatever is if it somehow is an educational component to help
Mhm.
you. Like if they see an inspirational message and send it to you, or if they see, hey, I watched this YouTube video and it had some great tips or meditation, you should, watch this every night or whatever. I think that's completely fine. But if they're texting you jokes about suicide, I mean, use your
It's
judgment there. That's like, if it feels icky, it's probably icky.
it honestly hurt my stomach, that one. But in the video, like the client seemed to, or the person seemed to have been okay with it and like laughing about it. I still think it's a red flag. Even if you think it's funny, even if you have that relationship, I think that's a boundary that's crossed and maybe something to bring up to your therapist.
Yeah, because you don't know how somebody's going to react, even if you think you know them. Like, how many times have we made a joke in front of somebody where we thought it was going to go well and then it just backfired? Imagine if that client, that person that posted that video, was having a really hard day. Maybe they're in therapy. So maybe, and they're suicidal, because they're expressing that to the therapist. So if you're having a
Yeah.
really bad day, that video could have gone a completely other direction. And yeah, that's a no-no. I can't believe that. I did not see that video.
Yeah, she is strong therapy. That's her at. She does really good responses because then the comment section filled up with people sharing similar stories of their
Wow.
therapist joking about suicide. And I even think if I have a client who's not suicidal, I'm not
Mhm.
joking about suicide with them either. I'm like just never joking about suicide
No,
because even in our
ever.
profession, we see it all the time. We hear about it all the time. I don't
Mhm.
think it should ever be a joke. And I understand like Gen Z's humor and like a lot of things
Yeah.
that they say and that they do, but I keep like reiterating the same
Yeah.
thing. I just think that's a boundary that's crossed and that's not okay.
At the end of the day, we are professionals and we can be held liable.
Yeah.
So anything that, might somehow lead to something, even if you think 100%, you don't. And so it's just, no, that's a definite red flag. I agree with you 100%. That's a no.
Yeah, and going, sorry, I know a lot of my examples are from TikTok because I'm obviously on there all the time. Another one was this video went viral, and I actually commented on it saying like this is unethical, and I got a lot of feedback saying no, it's not. So I want to hear your opinion on it. So he's leaving his therapy session, and he's amazing. I love his TikTok. I don't even know his at right now, but he's great. And he's like kind of screaming to the camera saying, "I need a new therapist because my therapist just told me that she can't work with me anymore because I give her anxiety."
Oh, I
And
think I saw that video.
in the comment section, I put like, "I'm so sorry this happened to you. This is really unprofessional and unethical." And I got a lot of people under saying, yeah, it's unprofessional, but I don't see it as being unethical. Therapists are human too. And I'm the
Mhm.
first person to advocate that therapists are human too, without a doubt. And I talk about my
Yeah.
anxiety all the
Yeah.
time. But personally, I think it's unethical to tell a client that they are the source of your anxiety, of your stress, of your
Yeah.
depression, of anything.
The first thing that comes to mind is they misunderstood what you meant by that comment, because I think, yeah, you're right. I'm 100% an advocate for therapists being human. I mean, we have a podcast named Anxious Like You because we are anxious therapists. And I think the issue is exactly what you said. It's not okay to tell your client that they are the source of your anxiety. It's not okay. So if you're like, oh, you like, okay, so let's like kind of draw a line here, because I've actually heard people say my therapist told me that she felt sad when I told her a story and therefore I'm never telling her anything again.
Mm,
And I'm like, okay, there's a difference between empathetic,
yeah,
reflecting a feeling, and
sharing.
blaming and shaming a client for how they are. So the video, from what I remember and what you're describing now, the therapist told them they couldn't see him anymore because he was the source of anxiety. So basically, you come to session and we're like, I'm sorry, I can no longer help you because you give me anxiety. That's wrong, because you could have handled that situation in saying, you know what, I don't think we're a good fit. There's some stuff that, like,
Yeah.
I'm being triggered with your story, and I think you deserve the best help possible. And maybe there's a better way than I'm even thinking, because that requires a lot of thought on how to say it, but
Yeah.
not in the way that was said. But I'm going to give you some referrals. On the other hand, you have, wow, Nadia, what you just shared with me, like I can really feel that. And like,
Yeah.
I feel really sad for what happened to you. And that's not a source for you to say, I've hurt my therapist. Even if your therapist cries in session, that might be a good thing.
Oh
Because that
yeah.
means they're empathizing, as long as they're not making it about them. Like, oh my gosh, like I can't handle, I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight because like you told me this like whole story and like, oh my God, I'm
Yeah.
re-traumatized. No.
This is why therapists have therapists or have supervisors or,
Mhm.
have groups that they talk about things. And this video actually caused one of my clients to bring it up to me in session and say, this made me think about how I make you feel after all of our sessions and I feel bad. And like that,
Wow.
yeah. And I was like, you should not feel that way. Like this is my job. This is what we're trained to
Yeah.
do. We know how to like prevent
Yeah.
burnout. We know how to take care of ourselves. I talk about seeing my own therapist. So like it made me sad that that video reached somebody that I work with and made them
To
feel
say
bad
that.
for like yeah, it made me
Yeah.
feel like icky.
Mhm. I've had people say that too, like, "Hey, are you okay? I feel like my stuff is too much, and, like, I just don't wanna put more stress on you." And I said, "No, like, this is my job." I mean, one of the biggest skills I've acquired as a therapist, I'm sure you have too, is to be able to care for yourself after each session and leave it there when you go home. And when I say leave it there, I'm not saying, oh, we forget about like I think about my clients constantly, but it's not in the way where it's impacting the rest of your day, because that's a skill we've acquired. And like you said, going to our own therapy to process certain things. And there's something
Right.
that a lot of people aren't aware of called supervision, which is really a fancy word, because not really you're supervising you, but they're kind of like it's like a bouncing off, like, you know, treatment modalities, and like
Right.
talking about cases that have been really hard with other licensed professionals, and then allowing yourself to kind of process that as well, because sometimes, yeah, you will hear horror stories, obviously, like this isn't a light job, but
Exactly.
it's our job. It's our job, like you said, to seek help for that. Not It's not on you at all. It should never be on you. You should never know. Um,
What yeah,
yeah,
exactly. You
yeah.
should never be told that you're the source of our stress, our
And they're never the
anxiety, or
source.
no,
They're
no,
never the
never.
source.
No, honestly, never. Like
Never. Like, you're
at
never the source. Never. Like, that is okay, let me rephrase that. A good therapist will never think or say that you're the source,
yes,
because
never
that you're
tell you something's trigger. Yeah, like
yeah, yeah,
rephrasing what we said earlier of like even mentioning, this is really triggering for me. I'm going to refer you out. I don't think either of us would say that,
yeah,
but I
yeah.
think if we did have to refer out, it would be told in a way
Yeah, it
that
would take
wouldn't
some
put
time.
blame on anyone. Yeah.
Well, I've had a couple of times where I had to refer out, right? And the way that that was handled wasn't like, "Okay, I can't see you anymore, you cause anxiety," or whatever. It wasn't even that type of situation. It was just, I didn't have the training to work with a
Right.
particular case. And, I always said, "Hey, I'm not gonna leave you until you find another therapist. We're gonna continue to meet if you want to,
Yeah.
unless you tell me you don't wanna meet with me anymore because I don't have this training." And most of the time, they're like, "No, please let me see you until I find a new therapist." And we do, and we kind of work through that, and they're never a source of, like, stress or anxiety. It's more of, like, I don't have the training, or maybe I'm going like 'cause sometimes, like, I'm the only thing I'm thinking of with this particular video that you're mentioning is, okay, let's say that somebody is going through a particular issue. Let's say that you're coming to a therapist for grief. Maybe you've lost someone in your life, and maybe that therapist has also recently lost somebody in their life. Maybe they haven't finished processing through that at all. And maybe that conversation is really triggering a lot of emotions for them in the session, but has nothing to do with you. It really has to do with what's going on in their
Their
personal
own.
life. Sometimes that type of thing does happen because, like you mentioned, therapists are human. So in that case, maybe they can say, right now, I'm kind of going through something similar. And I need to refer you out because I'm not even done processing through it right
Right.
now.
Yeah. You don't want
Um,
to like push your own stuff on them either. Or like if your
yeah.
grief looks different than someone else's and it works for you,
Mhm.
it's a tricky thing, but that's a good way to humanize it actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think grief is one of those things that happens to everybody. And it's like people lose people. And at some point, a therapist will lose somebody. And
Yeah.
sometimes there's, there's just times that you do need to refer out. Other cases, with suicide, sometimes maybe a therapist just lost someone. Maybe they can't see another suicidal case right now because they need to finish processing so that they can show up fully. What you want is a therapist that can show up fully for you.
Exactly.
And if a
Listen.
therapist has their own baggage right now and they're still processing through it, they may not, even if they're an amazing therapist, they may not be able to show up for you in that moment because of that stuff happening in their own personal lives.
Life.
So
And I
it's a
think that leads me to like such a good point that happened to me recently. I took over 2 weeks off work and I had to
Mhm.
reschedule all my appointments, obviously offer the referral, anything like that. And I had a client reach back out and say, like, it's really nice to see that you take time for yourself. It's actually a good example that's set for me and letting me know that like it's okay for me to take time off too. So I think
Yeah.
boundaries and taking that time off when you need it so you're not projecting or so you are fully present is also
Mhm.
important for a good therapist. And it's hard. It's hard when you feel like you're going through crisis and your therapist needs to take time off. And like I felt
Yeah.
that guilt of having to take time off, but I knew I couldn't be present there. And I
Mhm.
knew that it's not fair to my clients to just sit there and not be present, be focused on so many other things while I should be there treating them. So I think a good therapist will engage in self care, will know when they need to take off their own time
Mhm.
and trying to be an example, like we said earlier.
Yeah, exactly. One other important point that wanted to talk about in terms of bad therapist is pushing you to get some sort of treatment you're not ready to get without your consent, or forcing you to talk about something when you're not
Mm,
ready to talk about it.
that's a good point, forcing you not to talk about things and not to do things that you're not ready for. So what would you mean by that in therapy?
Well, the talking about something, like I automatically think of trauma survivors, and I think of like sometimes like we know that people aren't ready to talk about certain things. Maybe the client is just wants to come in and have a support system. Maybe they've never had space to just be. And even though again, this is therapist baggage, thinking, oh my God, we're not doing enough in session, that might
Mm,
be everything to a client. That might be all they need in that moment. And so forcing somebody to talk about something they're not ready to talk about can not only be re-traumatizing, but really counterproductive towards
yeah.
what you're trying to do. Another example is I know somebody in my personal life that had EMDR tricked and forced onto them. So I don't know if you guys are not familiar with EMDR, it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And basically, you can do it in a variety of ways, but one of them includes like eye movement while you talk about certain things. There's one that has like a buzzer, and you hold the
Right.
buzzer in both hands. And so this person was like, I'm not ready to do EMDR because like I have this like undiagnosed medical issue, and I know that EMDR can sometimes, like for instance, in epileptic clients, it's not necessarily recommended all the time. So they told the therapist that they weren't really ready for it because they weren't sure how their body was going to react to it. And so they um, kept going to session. And then one day, somehow, the therapist said, oh, this is the EMDR machine. I just wanted to show it to you. So they give the client the EMDR buzzers that they hold in each hand, and then all of a sudden these things are buzzing, and the person is talking about their problem, and then all of a sudden the person's like, hey, are we actually doing EMDR right now? And the therapist's like, yeah, see, it wasn't that bad, was it? So like it was like
Woo!
forced onto them, and
Oh
needless to
my
say, that
goodness.
person that I know never went back to that therapist again. But that is very unethical and
Yeah.
wrong on so many levels. Like that should never happen.
It feels like it's breaking some form of consent there.
A
Oh,
lot.
oh,
Yeah.
that's I even wonder like if I was put in that situation, would I ever trust a therapist again? I don't know. And I think that's something we see a lot too, of people having bad experiences and then never trusting
Never trust.
therapists. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
a horrifying story.
it is very horrifying. And yeah, you're right. Like I probably would have such a bad taste in my mouth for the profession
For,
in general. Like I wouldn't be
yeah.
able to trust. So that's like, it's like consent. If you look at the therapist paperwork before you start therapy, one of the things is informed consent. It is huge. No matter, and it should state it in there, like anything we do, any intervention we use has to be done with your consent. So that can be by asking like, hey, we're going to do this. Would you be okay with that? Even if it's something that seems pretty simple, like a breathing exercise, like, are you okay? Ask for consent. Asking for consent is so important. Hey,
Important.
I was thinking about doing a breathing exercise today. Are you okay with that? Or if they don't ask and say, hey, let's do some breathing, and you don't want to, you have every right to say, no,
Yeah.
I don't want to
That's so
do that
important.
today.
You
Yeah.
are the client. You can say no at any time. You can call out at any time. I'll always say too, like, please, if this is not something that you feel comfortable doing, if this is too much, if you need more, tell me.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out. I just keep going back to in my mind of your client, like using, like vocalizing that they want to structure things differently. It's just so
Yes.
important. And at the end of the day, you are the client. We are getting paid. It is a service to you. You get to decide what's working, what's not, what you want to change. And I
Yeah.
think that's a good way into like asking the next question of, if you do really like your therapist, but something happens, maybe there's like a little bit of pressure, or you feel like you weren't validated in a certain situation, how would you recommend telling your therapist that?
Yeah. So I think
Cool.
that's a really important question, because just because your therapist does something that doesn't sit well with you or you don't like, doesn't mean they're a bad therapist.
No.
Sometimes, I mean, we're human, right? Like we are going to make mistakes. We're going to do things you don't like sometimes,
Yeah.
say something that doesn't sit well. So I think honesty and bringing it up is the best thing to do. And it can be really telling about whether or not you're working with a healthy, good therapist or not as well.
Your
Um,
reaction. Yeah.
yeah. And I think there's multiple ways to do this. I think you could be really brave, like my client, and tell the therapist in session
Yeah.
about it. I think you can tell the therapist, can you ask me about something that I have feedback on in like a text or an email, and then they can bring it up the next session.
Mm-hmm.
You
One
can
of my
even
clients will do that too. She'll like,
yeah,
I'll get a text or an email saying like, do you mind if I email you some things before our session, and then you bring them up for us to talk about? I'm like, yeah,
amazing.
of course. Yeah. And I like that. I
Yeah.
like that dynamic. And that was something she did with her old therapist
Hmm.
and kind of brought into this. And I thought that was a great idea. Now I even will offer it to other people, of like ones
Yeah.
that I know won't feel comfortable doing that. I'll say like, just send me an email the night before if you feel comfortable, and then I'll bring it up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. So I think that's so empowering. I think one of the things about the therapeutic relationship is to empower you to feel safe and confident and
Yeah.
have a modeled healthy relationship. And healthy relationships don't come without conflict. They don't come without disagreements. They don't come without, some sort of rocky roads sometimes. And I think modeling that it's okay to say when you're not happy with something, whether it be by, like you said, email, like you don't feel comfortable talking to me to my face about it, that's fine.
Yeah.
Write it in an email and I'll bring it up next session. Or if you feel confident or you feel like you want to practice talking about things you don't like, then bring it up in session. The key there is, how does the therapist respond
Yeah.
when you
Yeah.
bring it up?
I
So,
think that is such a good telling sign of
mhm,
how the relationship is, or how
yeah.
they are.
And if you're looking for a template, I would say something like, hey, in our session today, or last session, we did this thing and it just made me feel a little bit uncomfortable. Can we talk about that? Or if you're going to
Yeah.
email it saying like, hey, I want to talk to you about something. Can you ask me what I want to talk about next session so that it's
That
easier to bring it up?
I love that. Yeah, I think that's a great template of how to
Yeah.
approach something. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, something, this is how I felt when you said ABC last week. Is that something we can talk about? I feel like I may be, taking it the wrong way, or I feel like maybe you can clarify what you meant by that. And
Exactly.
that's,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
And it's also like a learning opportunity or a skills opportunity, like you said, to work on confrontation or to work on bringing things up or to get confident in having those conversations. And especially if you really like your therapist and you want it to be a long-term relationship, it's a
yeah,
relationship. There are
yeah.
things that like you're going to need to address like you would in any other relationship. So it's important.
Yeah. And that actually brings me to this point that I was talking about earlier about a good enough therapist. Because when we're talking about like good enough, we're not talking about perfect. So you don't want to run at the first sign of some sort of conflict with your therapist. That's probably not helpful for you, to
No.
continue to change therapists. Good enough simply means that you trust that the therapist has your best interest in mind, that your therapist is showing up compassionately and present every single session, that your therapist truly does care about your well-being and your progress. But something happens sometimes every once in a while, and maybe they say something, or they keep doing this one thing that really bothers you, or maybe they keep looking at the clock, or maybe they
Yeah.
have an alarm that goes off 15 minutes before session's over, and it really throws you off. I had a therapist that did that once.
Oh.
It was like the only negative thing about it. And I was like, oh man, can we just like turn that shit off? But like, it was like the way she kept herself on track, which find better ways sometimes. But
Yeah.
regardless, it's like, okay, is that make or break? Like, does that mean like I'm never
Right.
gonna go back because of the no, sometimes it's about finding like it's almost like any relationship. Like you're not gonna find a perfect fit. So like what's a deal breaker and what's not a deal breaker, So is it a deal breaker that the therapist keeps looking at the clock? Sometimes it is. For certain people, it is, because
Yeah.
what message is that sending to you? But to some people, it's like, hey, can you stop looking at the clock? Like, I'll put an alarm on my Apple Watch so that you don't have to keep
Yeah.
looking at the clock. I mean, to some, it depends on your personality and your needs, but like, good enough is what we're looking for, like finding a good
Right.
enough therapist. And that's up to you to determine, like, what's that?
It's making me laugh because I was going through renovations for the longest time and I still don't have a clock in my therapy office. And not somebody got upset, but they were just like, it makes me nervous that you don't have a clock here. So I'm going to take my phone out and I'm going to check my phone every once in a while so I know the time. I'm like, yeah, of
Yeah.
course, go for it. Like I should get a clock. I know, but I still don't have one. I use my computer,
Yeah.
which is and I know it's annoying for some people because only I can see it. But now she puts her phone on the couch and she checks it. And it was frustrating for her. And like, I don't mind, of course, do that.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah.
a little bit of a jab that I should get a clock.
Get a
For
clock.
everyone.
Yeah.
I need a clock. Yeah.
One for them. Actually, my office, I have one for the clients and one for
And one
me.
for
So like
I
there's
need
one
that.
that, yeah, so they can see and I can see, because I realize that as a client, I am one of those that like I need to know where we are. So I know where like how
To
much can I
go.
disclose right now? Like,
And that's what it is too, of like, okay, wait, how much time do I have left? What do I want to bring up? So yeah.
yeah.
I'm
Telehealth has been
a bad
helpful for that.
therapist. I should have a thing.
No,
Yeah.
you are an
No,
amazing
I'm
therapist.
I'm
Steph.
just kidding.
But
Okay,
yeah,
so we mentioned at the beginning that there can be a good therapist, but it could not be the best fit for you. So
yes, yes, it.
you like even me, I've worked with therapists in the past that have been great. Just with me, I know that
Mhm.
we like didn't blend as well as I would like for that to happen. What do
Yeah.
you think that looks like?
I think like any relationship, this is something that like was mind blowing when a therapist said to me one time, or my supervisor back in the day said to me, like, a therapeutic relationship is like any other relationship. Do you get along and like click with every single human you come into contact with? And the answer is probably no, right? And so we have to take that same approach with a therapist, because they may be an amazing therapist, but for some reason that vibe in the room is just not present. Like you
Yeah.
just, for some reason, aren't feeling each other. Like maybe you can sense that the therapist doesn't know how to respond to you, or maybe you are somebody who copes with a lot of humor and you like it, like you want somebody to like kind of like joke around with, and like that
Yeah.
therapist just keeps a straight face the whole time, or vice versa. Maybe the therapist is really jokey and you're like, I'm not into that. It could be fit. It can also be like therapeutic approaches. So we were talking earlier about like what my client told me about wanting to vent. instead of wanting to really do more of like the structured work. Sometimes there are therapists that aren't okay with that, or vice versa. Maybe they're not into structured, but you need structured. So it's not about them being a bad therapist or you not being a good enough client or not trying hard enough. It simply is you're looking for something different. And that's therapist does exist out there. And I won't lie to you, I went through 6 therapists myself before I found one that I liked.
Yeah.
It's hard to find a therapist. It is not easy. So that's why it's really important. And I know it's draining to interview and go to session and then realize they're not a good fit. But if you can get through that, then you might end up in like a really good place. So I just think fit comes down to therapeutic approach, personality, um, what you're looking for, age sometimes, like, maybe you're somebody who's looking for more of like this motherly figure, or
Yeah.
maybe you're looking for more of that friendly figure, sister
Right.
figure kind of thing. Maybe there's so many different things. So it's really hard. It's something you have to discover.
Right. And I find lived experience is also a good one.
Yeah.
Me personally, I like working with someone who's similar in age to me who is also identifying as a female.
Yeah.
Like for me, that's important. A lot of my anxiety comes from my lived experience. So it's nice knowing somebody may have experienced something similar. So it really depends on what you're looking for. I like that you mentioned like a mother figure, because my mind immediately goes to like somebody who is the same age as you, but it's so true. A lot of people will seek a father figure, a mother figure, somebody maybe with more lived experience who has a lot of training or a lot of experience working. So yeah, there's something out there for everyone for sure.
For everybody. Absolutely. Like when I look for therapists, I typically go for like, I don't know why, like older therapists.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. It's like that grandmother, like, I don't know why. I just feel really safe to
Like that.
talk to them about things. Funny because I've never tried a like super young therapist. Actually, one time, I lied, one time. And it was like, eh.
Yeah.
Eh.
Not the
So
best.
for me, I don't know why. There's nothing wrong with the therapist.
No. Yeah.
He was a great therapist, but it was just like not, for whatever reason, just was not working. So it's really like, yeah, like you have to find whatever
Works for you. Yeah. And like more like personal information, same thing. If I'm like, or what I was in the past, going for low self-esteem and like my looks and my appearance, it's a little bit more difficult going with like a man maybe who doesn't
Yes.
understand the same thing. But that's different. Like maybe there are people who do. And so that's completely different. That's not invalidating anyone or their experience. That's just personal
Absolutely.
preference.
Yeah. And gender of the therapist, sexuality of the therapist,
Yeah.
Racial background of the therapist, maybe something that
Religion.
Exactly. Like if
Culture.
you're
These
not,
are all big
if
things.
you're not religious and a therapist, I have another story. There was this person that I knew that went to a therapist after her father had died. And the therapist told her, well, there was like family therapy for the whole family. And her sister had the experience of her father coming to her in a dream. And so like the therapist was like, oh, look, your father loves you so much that he showed up in your dream. But my friend was like, that didn't
I
happen
know
to
where
me.
this is going.
Yeah, like, and, and so it was like very religious based. So like basically what happened was just like, oh, you're not religious enough, or you're not praying hard enough to have your father come to you in a dream or something like that. And that is, although it may have been comforting to one of the sisters, because it's like, this is like, she's affirming that could be like an experience, it was really invalidating to the other sister. And it's just really fucked up.
That's difficult. Wow. Yeah. Was it like, I'm just using this as an example of a form, but was it Christian counseling? Was it like,
I don't know.
Classified as that? Oh, okay.
I don't know, because it was a long time ago that I heard this story, but I'm assuming it was. I think it was out of a church. So that's another thing. And my friend is not religious at all. So then there's like that. like fit. So maybe for somebody that could have been a really good source of comfort and faith and spirituality. And for another person, so it's really important fit. This is a fit thing, like
It's a
maybe
fit
that
thing. That's
therapist.
why I'm thinking maybe it's not a
Mhm.
therapist thing. Maybe because they specialize in Christian counseling.
Yes.
Maybe it's a fit thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I had another story with that. I'm not gonna, like I think there was somebody else that I heard was doing some sort of like, I don't know if it was hypnotherapy or like something, or like going back in the moment. And it was like a really traumatic moment in their lives. And then the therapist goes, okay, now imagine you see Jesus. And that was like, no. Like that threw off everything. That threw off everything for that person, because
Oh, so
they
it
were like,
was not like
it was not, yeah.
Catholic Christian. Like,
I
oh
don't
my
think,
God, my reaction right now because you can't see it is just like
yeah.
speechless. And I'm gonna have
And
some projection here, so I'm not gonna say it, but that's
mess up.
yeah. Mhm.
I think it's okay. This is what like the fit is like, if you're going to a Christian counselor,
Yes.
then expect to have that type of thing. But if you're not calling somebody for that's a question that I ask on my paperwork often. It's like, how are you religious? Is religion something that you
Me too.
lean on, or is it not? Because I think it's really important to know, because I'm not a religious person. And so when I get a client that's really religious, and if they're talking about religion, I will use that with them. Like I will be like, yeah, so like, did you pray? If the praying is something
Yes.
that, they like, I use whatever they want me to use, but I will never ever use it if they don't use it first, even if they're super like religious. And I will never ever bring anything into like my own faith or anything like that into session
Yeah.
with a client. So it's important to know. So a good fit is like
A good
going
fit. But
back to
that
that.
raises another point too of like even me where I've worked with clients who are very into their faith, and that's when I'm doing my own research. That's when I'm trying to learn about
Yes.
their culture, learn about their faith with them. And I think that's something a good social
Mhm.
worker, a good therapist should and would do as well. Just like I said, we really want to know our clients and understand them as a
Yeah.
whole in order to learn why they do things that
Yeah.
they do. So a good therapist will do research, whether it's with you or not, about understanding your experience and your life.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. I'm gonna let me see if I can see some of the Instagram stories that
Yeah.
people, we can read them really quickly. So I'm gonna read some of these, and then Nadia and I can come to like take a little vote. No, or I guess this could, like, we can
Yeah,
kind of
yeah, yeah.
justify
That's
a
good.
certain
Like,
thing.
quick.
Like, okay,
Yeah,
like
let's
really
do
quick. Okay, so here's one.
it.
They told me I was being dramatic and shouldn't cry so much.
No, no,
No,
no,
no.
no, no, no.
Like, fuck no.
Fuck to the no. Yeah.
Okay. A trauma therapist recently charged my credit card for several virtual visits that she canceled.
No.
No. Okay. My question is, was that an accident? Was it like, talk to the therapist about it for sure? Because it could have been accidental if they have like an
Yes.
automated system. But if they're charging
Fine.
you and saying, no, I have to charge you regardless, that is a fuck no, find a new therapist.
But that's a good point because my system will automatically do that. And then if
Mhm.
I forget to cancel the client, if I cancel the appointment, yeah, I've made that mistake
Yeah.
before. So I said fuck no way
I
too
have to.
early. But
Yeah.
yeah, if it's multiple times, reach out because that's your
Yeah.
money.
I've done that accidentally before too, because like if I'm sick and I just don't go on, it automatically takes it. But then I'm like calling the client. I'm like, I'm so sorry, it charged you. You get a choice. Do you want a refund or a free session next time?
Exactly. Yeah.
And typically they're totally okay with that. But this sounds like it's several times, and I'm not sure, it's not said if they were refunded or whatever. So yeah, that would be the deciding factor. Like, what did the therapist say about it? But very bad. Yeah. Um, ooh. I've had a therapist talk in detail about his sex life with his sexy wife.
Nope.
Oh
No.
no. That is
No.
like, why is that even happening? Like, you guys know you can report these people, right?
Why do you know his wife? Like he mentions that he has a sexy wife and then tells you about
Apparently.
no.
Like, because his sexy wife is, yeah, written
Unless
here.
it's sex therapy. I mean,
I don't even think you can talk about yourself in sex therapy.
no, yeah, no, no, no. I take that
No.
back.
We're gonna have to
No.
have a sex therapist on so we can like ask some questions, but this is
Questions.
not okay. No, no.
Oh.
He said that people like me, in quotes, people like me, could never be fixed.
No.
What the fuck? No. Okay, first of all, there
Oh,
is
that breaks
nothing
my
to be fixed.
heart.
I'm so sorry. I am so sorry that that happened to you.
Oh,
First of all, you're not broken. You have gone through tough times and your body is responding and your mind are responding in ways that are adaptive to keep you safe. And maybe those adaptive responses are no longer adaptive right now. But guess what? You can learn to find safety and happiness again. So don't let that dickhead. When I had ED symptoms, eating disorder symptoms, my therapist said I was just pulling cards to add more issues on me.
oh my God.
Okay, the next one is I was sharing a particular childhood trauma about being bullied and they laughed a lot. No, you don't
They
laugh at
laugh.
somebody's yeah, they laughed at the trauma story of being bullied.
Mm-mm,
No,
mm-mm. Oh
fire the
God.
therapist. My therapist shared her conservative political beliefs after I came out to her. I'm gay.
Nope. Nope. Report,
No.
report, report,
Report,
report.
report, because this is when you come out to a therapist, it's supposed to be a safe space. And by them disclosing their conservative political beliefs after you coming out to a therapist, what they're essentially saying, but not directly saying to you,
Yeah.
is I don't think you're
Accept.
there. I'm not accepting you. Like,
I
I'm
don't
not.
accept you.
Mhm.
Yeah. A therapist can have political beliefs,
Mhm.
but you can't project them. You can't use them to shame. You can't. Oh my goodness. That another
Yeah.
thing that breaks my heart. Please get a new therapist.
Please get a new therapist. Every week, the lady would talk about outer space and her previous work experience. I don't know what I have so many questions about outer space right now because like
Yeah.
what could possibly come up that is she an astronaut? I mean, even then, like, no. Yeah. Okay. If therapists talk about things that interest them to that extent, please use some of the skills we mentioned earlier to like
Stop them.
stop them and tell them, you know what, I understand you have some awesome hobbies and really have some interests, but like I really need this session to be about me. So having heard those, like hopefully you guys have much better therapists if you sent one of those in. But if you've recognized through this conversation, Nadia, I'm going to ask you this question to see like if you have any ideas on how we can do this. I know this has been a very popular question, and I'm sure people are listening and thinking, oh shit, I might have a not so good therapist here. Um, if you want to break up with your therapist, what are some how can we do that? What are different ways that we can break up with a therapist? Obviously, they range from non-directive at all to super directive.
Directed. Yeah.
And can we talk about what are some ideas you have for breaking up with a therapist?
Yeah. So if you listened to this episode and you realized, or if you've already been thinking it and just didn't know, there's a couple different ways. I think as a therapist, a way that I appreciate the most, but I know it's really difficult, is just saying, like, hey, this hasn't been a good fit for me. I'm going to seek treatment elsewhere. Or do you have a referral? As therapists, we are obligated to give referrals if we get asked. So we will send you to somebody that we trust or somebody we think that would be able to work well with you. I know
Mm.
that's not easy. I know maybe saying something like, hey, I decided to put our sessions on hold for a little bit, if that's truly the case and you did want to put it on hold. But I think honesty is the best. And I think it's a good opportunity to even use as a way to build up that confidence to be able to be honest with your therapist and be proud of yourself for doing it. We won't take offense. I would like to know, like, hey, things aren't working out. Of course, like we mentioned in the past, if it's something that like we can work on and continue to work on, then like let's use it as a way to build our relationship and call me out on things if you feel comfortable. But if it's not a good fit at all and you feel comfortable telling me, that's ideal. I mean,
Mm.
I don't think it's always. I've ghosted therapists before.
I was just
It's
going to
hard
ask you,
not
do you think
to.
it's okay to ghost a therapist?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's not okay. I think it's fine. I think if your experience was horrible and you had a really bad first session and you never want to go back, like you can ghost them, you can call them out, you can use your own judgment. I think it's really awkward and sometimes really hard. So there's no shame or
Yeah.
judgment here if you have ghosted your
No.
therapist.
Yeah.
But from a therapist perspective, we like it when we know it gives us a chance to build for the next person or an opportunity to grow. So
I've
yeah.
ghosted like 3 therapists before. So I think, okay, so like that, like to kind of go, yeah, I think ghosting is very appropriate in some instances. Like if you're a good therapist, like you're mentioning, Nadia is a good therapist. So if somebody doesn't want to see her anymore, it's less likely because she's a bad therapist and won't accept it, but rather because maybe it wasn't a good fit or whatever.
Right.
So I think in that instance, it would be safe to come to you and tell you that. But having all of the examples we had previously, I'm assuming that some people just don't make you safe enough to tell them that. And in those instances, I would say, I don't care if you've been seeing them for 6 months. Yes, you can ghost them, because if you didn't feel safe talking to them about anything, there's probably not going to be safety in telling them that. And if that's going to make your life harder, then you know what? Ghosting is sometimes the only option we have. So don't judge
Absolutely.
yourself for doing it. I mean, if you're doing it, even though the therapist is like really nice and understanding, then maybe you got to work a little bit on, like communication and feeling safe expressing your needs. But if they're just like really messed up therapists, then I don't think there's a problem with ghosting at all. I think this was a really informative episode. I really hope that you guys really appreciated this. By the way, if you guys have been listening to our podcast and you're really enjoying this, we love 5-star reviews. And we're going to steal this from one of the hosts we had, but we're too sensitive to like see anything less than 5 stars because we're very anxious. So we would love a 5-star review with, what your thoughts are on the episodes. And that will make us really, really happy. Plus, make sure you're following us on @AnxiousLikeYou on Instagram, and screenshot whatever episode you're listening to, tag us. We will reshare, and we will be so excited to know who's listening, because we there's nowhere where we can see who's listening, and we just like really love to see the screenshots and what you guys are thinking of the episode. So again, hope you enjoyed this one, and we will chat with you next time.
Thanks for tuning in. If you like what you heard, make sure to subscribe and leave a review. Join the Anxious Like You community by following @AnxiousLikeYou on Instagram. See you in the next episode.